As you all are finishing up, we're going to go ahead and get started. You can ignore me and keep eating, but please finish eating by the time that I introduce our keynote speaker. I believe we have the blessing to take some questions and offer some answers at the end of Matthew's talk. But before I introduce our keynote speaker, I wanted to introduce the head table. To my immediate right, of course, is our beloved shepherd and teacher in Christ, His Grace Bishop Basil, Bishop of the Diocese of Wichita, Mid-America. Next is the very Reverend Don Hawk, the priest and pastor of St. Mary Orthodox Church in Omaha, Nebraska, and the dean of our deanery, the Great Plains Deanery, Korea Maggie, is next to him, Father Don's lovely wife. And next to Korea Maggie is the lovely Hiram Montford, who we all know and love, and we know even more. And most of us love even more after last night's presentation. To my immediate left is Matthew Namee. I'll talk more about him in a moment. My lovely wife, Korea Anastasia, is gracing the table. And then we have the very Reverend Andrew Yanney, priest and pastor of St. Paul, Orthodox Church in Emmaus, Pennsylvania, and author, blogger, podcaster, classmates, and friend, most importantly. I want to thank His Grace and all of our presenters for the symposium last night. We want to thank you and welcome all of you pilgrims coming from 16 different states to be here for this pilgrimage. And we want to extend a special welcome to the Yanney family members. I omitted this, but the Yanney families, those related to Father Nicola, have a red ribbon, so we want to welcome all of you on that red ribbon on their name tag. I want to extend a special thanks to our pilgrimage committee members, Sarah, Joey, Myron, Marlene, Amanda, Kim, Levi, Amy, and of course Rocky Steiner. These are the people who work so very hard. So very hard to coordinate and plan this very special event, and of course we want to thank, together with them, all of the volunteers, both from inside the parish and from outside the parish, who did so much work. So thank you all. You all got to experience, those of you coming to pilgrims, just a little bit during this weekend, what I get to experience every day of my life as the priest and pastor of St. George. God gracing me to be the priest of such a wonderful and hospitable community. There's no place like St. George. A very special thanks is due to Rocky and Diane Steinbrück, who set the tone. Hold your applause. So you can applause a lot after you hear what I'm about to say. Rocky and Diane set the tone for this whole pilgrimage when in the early planning stages they offered this meal as a mercy meal for Father Nicola. So they offered this to you all at no expense to the parish. And from that, the parish said, and the pilgrimage committee said, let's stretch and see if we can make this an event that you all can come to for free. So we owe them thanks for this dinner, for setting the tone for this pilgrimage. And when twice We have outgrown various locations, and on Sunday morning, we were originally going to offer a potluck and have some real St. George hospitality like you experienced this afternoon, a potluck Sunday. When we outgrew Friday night's event, we knew we were going to outgrow being able to serve you in the church on Sunday morning. Rock and Down are also offering in their generosity tomorrow's lunch at Divine Liturgy. So thank you so much, Rock and Down, for setting the tone. That I want to make this evening, and unfortunately I do not see her here, and that is to Virginia Suleiman. You're not here, are you, Virginia? I didn't overlook Virginia. We owe Virginia a lot, because we are here to remembering and learning more about the very special man, Father Nicola Yanney. That research into his life began with Minette Steinberg, Rocky and Steve's beloved mother and Paul's wife, granddaughter of Father Nicola Yanney. And Virginia's husband, Bob, helped that. They have both departed this life and are of blessed memory, but Virginia Suleiman continued that work. She spent many hours translating Arabic sources, Father Nicola's family Bible, all the issues of the Al-Kalamat, the word magazine, in its original Arabic, newspaper articles. She found many different sources, and because of her labors, I also want to give a special welcome to the Hodge family, because Father Paul, as we know last night, Siedna and Father Philip were very much a part of the researching into Father Nicola's life following Mitzi. But Father Paul really took that on and handed it off to us. So we want to give them a big thanks too. And because of the work of the people at the head table, the Hodges, of course, Rocky and his family, but especially Virginia, we now know what Father Nicola did, where he did it, and when he did it. And as that full picture emerged, we were all amazed. And that is why we have asked Matthew Namee to come and give the keynote. When the Pilgrimage Committee was thinking about potential speakers, one name came up and one name only, and that was Matthew Namee. So we were very happy that he graciously accepted. Matthew Namee is, he told me just now, his greatest accomplishment is he is the editor of OrthodoxHistory.org. He is the co-founder with Father Andrew Gamick of the Society of Orthodox Christian History in America. But his greatest accomplishment is giving his lovely parents 5 beautiful grandchildren. Matthew has a degree in history. I'm going to talk about that in just a minute. And is a lawyer. Has worked as a lawyer. He is now working as a lawyer, supporting exclusively Orthodox organizations and institutions that are nonprofits. As I was picking him up and driving him from Lincoln, he told me a little about what he does, and alluded to some of the people that he talks to, and then he said, I can't tell you about that. And I got that feeling, I can tell you, but I'd have to kill you. So he's doing incredibly important work that most of us don't know about, to strengthen, to refine, to encourage Orthodox institutions and organizations that are really leading the way in between the ministry of Christ and the teaching of our Orthodox faith and reconciliation, I also believe, throughout the world. But his passion is history. from a young man interested in the saints, interested in learning about his faith, as he just also said. Bishop Basil was the one who answered all of his questions as a curious young man and introduced him to modern day and contemporary saints. And he researched and he dove in. And unlike most of us who went to college and got a degree, he was doing this before he studied in college. And he was a historian before he got his degree and decided to get his degree because of his passion. He was looked upon and called upon as an expert in Orthodox history in the Americas before he had his history degree. So deep and broad is his knowledge. Matthew Namee, as accomplished as he is also the best and most knowledgeable historian about Orthodox Christianity in America. And he's a son of Dewama, St. Mary, Wichita. So, it is our great privilege to have the best Orthodox historian speak to us and enlighten us about the life of a profound man. It is one of the reasons that we are all here 100 years later. Not just at this pilgrimage, not just in this diocese, but in the Orthodox faith. So Matthew, we look forward to your words about the Reverend Father Nicola.
I don't know if I can live up to that. Thank you. It's incredibly kind. So, I mentioned this last night, but I think the first time I became aware of Father Nicola was in 2004, when Bishop Basil gave his enthronement address. And he talked about this circuit-riding priest who had this huge territory that basically covered the entire middle of the United States. And it was impressive, for sure, but I have to be honest, to me at the time, it didn't stand out. There were a lot of circuit-riding Orthodox priests in those days. There were Greeks, Russians, Serbs, all different parts of the country doing the same kind of thing, generally speaking, that Father Nicola was doing. And I wasn't here for the diocesan pilgrimage 10 years ago, but it struck me as a family honoring their forefather, which is a completely appropriate thing to do, but not necessarily something that's a big deal for people who aren't part of the family already, who aren't already in this diocese. Father Nicola is the ancestor of the Diocese of Wichita, and he's interesting to us because he's ours. But if you're Greek or Russian or Serbian or Romanian or you live on one of the coasts, Father Nicola is just another old priest. And there were a lot of those guys. I'm not here to talk about Father Nicola because he's the forefather of the Diocese of Wichita, or because he was the first priest ordained by St. Raphael, or because he's a somewhat notable historical figure in American Orthodoxy. Those things are all true, but they're footnotes. The reason Father Nicola is important, and the reason he warrants our attention, not just of Antiochians in mid-America, but of the entire Orthodox world, is because he's an icon of faithfulness and endurance and sacrifice for the sake of Christ. The legacy of Father Nicola is not merely this diocese. The legacy of Father Nicola is sanctity. Father Nicola's early biography is interesting, but it's not necessarily uncommon. He grew up near the Balaman Monastery, he got married in his late teens, and he left his village to come to America to try to make a life for his family that was better than what was available in Syria. And in this, he was like so many others, including my own family and many of yours. America was the land of opportunity, and seeking out that opportunity meant leaving behind home and family and community. He was just Nicola Yanney then, not yet Father Nicola, of course. And he and his wife Martha went first to Omaha And then there Nicola worked as a peddler. And again, this was like a lot of young Syrian immigrants at the time, including my own ancestors. They had kids. They moved to a little homestead not far from Kearney, Nebraska, and they planted modest roots. And I don't know what their expectations were, but I'm not even sure if they had expectations. I know that they were pious Orthodox Christians who had gone years without even seeing a priest, much less confessing or taking communion or having their kids baptized. And then one day, something unexpected happened, which we talked about today. The year was 1899. Nicola and Martha had been in Nebraska for about 6 years, almost. And a few years earlier, a dynamic young Syrian priest named Father Raphael Hawawini had come to America to minister to the scattered Syrian immigrants in America. And now in the late summer of 1899, St. Raphael made it all the way to the remote town of Kearney. Now I'll let St. Raphael himself tell the story from his missionary journal. And I know we read that today, but I think it bears repeating. Some of it, not all of it. On Tuesday, September 7th, I departed Omaha and went further west to the city of Kearney, where I arrived after midnight instead of arriving at 3:30 p.m. as planned. When I arrived in Kearney, almost all of our Syro-Arabs came to greet me at the station. From the train, they took me to the house of their elder in an open carriage. It was so cold that I was shivering all the way and warmed up only at the fireplace in the house of my hosts and paid for it with sniffles. We all stayed up until 4 in the morning, after which time everyone went home to get some rest. The next morning I felt so bad I wasn't able to serve the Divine Liturgy, but only a Typica service. So let me pause here for a moment. This account starts to tell you something about St. Raphael, how devoted he was to his people. His train was delayed for 8 hours, and he arrived exhausted after midnight, and he was cold, and he felt sick. And then he stayed up until 4 in the morning visiting his people. And then he basically took a little nap and got up and celebrated a church service, even though he felt so bad he couldn't serve the Divine Liturgy. So St. Raphael continues. In the evening I felt better and offered to the members of the local community to go on horses to the farm of one of the Orthodox Syro-Arabs who lives there with his family and brother, located about 18 miles to the northeast of Kearney. At 9 p.m., with 15 people with me, on 4 horse-drawn carriages, we departed for our journey. The weather was beautiful, the road was even, and it was a full moon. My companions enjoyed it so much that the entire trip they were singing church and national songs. Okay, so St. Raphael we know he was sleep deprived, and he was fighting a bad cold. And then he hears about this farmer, Nicola Yanney, and his family who were living way out in the country, and he volunteered to go to them in the middle of the night. You don't know if you caught that, but this was his idea. It wasn't like somebody said, hey, we should go to see this guy. No, it was St. Raphael. He heard about these people, and he went to them. This is the good shepherd who leaves the 99 sheep and seeks the one who is lost. In this case, not lost spiritually. The Yanneys were spiritually quite strong, but literally lost in the wilderness. He could have sent some of the Kearney Syrians to go bring the Yanneys back to the city, but no, he went to them himself, in person. That's the kind of pastor St. Raphael was. And I've spent a lot of my life studying St. Raphael's life. And this is very consistent with his behavior his entire ministry. This is a typical St. Raphael thing to do. So he continues. We arrived at the house of our farmers at about 1 in the morning. From all the noises and firing from handguns of my companions, the farmers ran out from their house and learned that their priest has arrived, and they were so overjoyed that with tears of thanksgiving they embraced us and kissed the ground, my hands and my feet, thanking the Lord God who granted them to see an Orthodox priest after 7 years without one. Truthfully, we all cried as well, seeing such joyous greetings from them. The wife of the farmer cried more than anyone from her joy. She was mourning so much that living in such a distant place, she was deprived of the ability to see an Orthodox priest who could confess and commune them. and most importantly would baptize her 4 children, the oldest of which was 6 years old. Now her sorrow has turned to joy, and not believing her eyes, she continually crossed herself, raising her hands to heaven, thanking the Lord for this unexpected mercy. And St. Raphael concludes, the home was very small. We all stayed in one room. From exhaustion, some started falling asleep on their chairs, others on the floor, and I was offered a small couch. In the morning, everyone with piety attended the Matins service. After that, I served the blessing of waters and blessed the house and their entire farm. Having spent the entire day there, we returned to Kearney in the evening. The next day, the farmer with his whole family and the brother came to the Divine Liturgy and for the baptism of their children. So this was Nicola's first encounter with St. Raphael. And more than that, it was his first encounter with a proper Orthodox missionary. He had known, of course, priests and monks in Syria, but St. Raphael was something different. He was a pastor with a flock that wasn't concentrated in a village, but was scattered across a continent. And Raphael's devotion and self-sacrifice to care for the most isolated of people left a deep impression on Nicola that became apparent during his own years as a missionary priest. Eventually, St. Raphael left and life continued for the Yanneys. They had 4 little kids. Martha was expecting their 5th. Nicola was 29 years old, so he would have 5 kids before the age of 30. And then something went wrong. As we heard about earlier today, Martha wasn't well. She went into labor too early. There was no one to help, and even the best doctors at the time probably couldn't have done anything. Martha died in childbirth, and so Nicola was a widower at 29 years old with 5 kids. And then he watched helplessly as his newborn baby wasted away and died too just days later. I know that infant death was much more common than it is now, and I also know it was a lot more common back then for women to die in childbirth. But that should not take away from the agony that Nicola and his surviving children experienced. As a husband and a father, my own 5th child was born a couple months ago in August. I feel a particular sorrow for Nicola, and every time I think about what happened and what he went through, the pain of a loss like that can never go away. But it's what happened next after Nicola became widowed, what he did at that point that really begins to set him apart, and we really get to see what kind of a person he is. Before Nicola, there were 2 paths. One of them was narrow and one of them was broad. The broad path would have been remarriage, and you can hardly fault him for choosing that path. He had little kids who needed a mother. He was a young man. He was only 29 years old. He easily could have justified remarrying, mourning for a time, and then finding a new wife among the many, many Syrian immigrants who kept coming into the United States and even reaching as far as Nebraska. So there were options if he wanted to pursue that path. The narrow path, the alternative, was essentially unheard of. It wasn't like the priesthood was a viable career option in America in this time. We didn't have seminaries in America. There were no seminaries. There was not an Antiochian bishop in America yet. Orthodoxy had barely begun to take root, and there were only a smattering of parishes in the whole country of any ethnic background, not just Syrian Antiochian parishes, but of any background. But a little over a year after Martha's death, the Orthodox Syrians in Kearney wanted a parish of their own, and they decided as a group that Nicola should be their priest. This was actually, as an aside, this was this kind of a idea of the community sort of picking their priest or having a major role in picking their priest was something that it was done in villages in Syria. It was even done under St. Raphael in other parishes of his in America. And it's interesting, I don't know if this is now going a little off script, but I don't know if this is actually causally related, but I did a study years ago to try to figure out which of the different Orthodox groups in America in the early 20th century had the most stability in terms of the parish priests not changing a whole bunch. And it was by far, it was St. Raphael's parishes, by far. And I wondered if this practice that he had occasionally of having the community sort of be involved in picking the priest had some role in that stability. So, Nicola was offered a cross to bear, and he agreed to bear this cross. And it meant that he would never be married, of course. It also meant he would have to sacrifice time with his children for the sake of his priestly ministry, but he could hardly have foreseen just what level of sacrifice he would be called to make. While all this was going on, St. Tikhon, the Russian archbishop, had arranged for St. Raphael to become a bishop himself, which would give the Syrians their own bishop. In early 1904, Nicola traveled from Kearney to New York City to be present at St. Raphael's consecration and then to be ordained a priest, which we heard about yesterday. This was the first time he had ever been away from his kids for any real length of time, the first really big trip. And they stayed with some of his family. And after his ordination, Father Nicola spent time with St. Raphael. He was mentored by St. Raphael. And then he returned to Nebraska. And he wasn't just coming back to pastor this fledgling community in Kearney. St. Raphael had given him responsibility for an enormous geographic area, covering a territory that's roughly the same size, would you say, as the current diocese of Wichita in Mid-America. But one priest. St. Raphael may have been the shepherd to the lost sheep in America. But as a practical matter, that was just too much territory for anyone. And so Father Nicola would be his deputy, and he would himself be the shepherd to the lost sheep of Mid-America. Father Nicola's missionary travels are exhausting to read. If I actually tried to convey an accurate sense of these travels, your eyes would glaze over, and I would never finish this talk. Seriously, this is a big part of Father Nicola's story. It's something I cannot delve into because I would lose the entire audience. But it is overwhelming when you actually read about his travels and the months that he would be gone. He routinely spent 6+ months away from home in a chunk, right? Not just like 6 months, a month here, a month home, a month away. 6 months plus at a time away from home. He would leave his kids in the care of his brothers. And we're talking about trips across vast areas of land, mostly by train, sometimes by horse and buggy. Nights spent in all manner of uncomfortable and makeshift beds. Cold, heat, loneliness, discomforts of every sort. Again, this would go on for many, many months at a time. It's a level of asceticism that most of us can barely fathom. Father Nicola did not travel so much because he wanted to be away from his family. It's important to understand this and to understand the difference, this is really important, between Father Nicola and St. Raphael, because their actions are similar, but their characters and personalities are very different. St. Raphael is a great saint who sacrificed a lot. But St. Raphael was restless by nature. He was, from the time he was a young man in Syria, he was constantly moving around. He had so much energy, and he was traveling around. He didn't, it wasn't enough to travel all over the Patriarchate of Antioch, so he went to Russia. And then he came to the best job he could have possibly gotten, which was America. Because it meant he could travel all over the place, whenever he felt like he was necessary. He didn't like to sit still. He was always on the move. When he wasn't on the road away from New York, there were always projects to occupy him there. So he was building a cathedral, establishing a cemetery. And of course, St. Raphael was a monk, so he had no children, nothing really to miss while he was traveling. This isn't to downplay what St. Raphael did. But Father Nicola was very different. That's the point I want to make. From all the evidence that we have, he seemed to be more of a homebody, happy to spend months on end working diligently on his little farm, which he had to give up when he became a priest. So he didn't just give up the possibility of remarriage, seeing his children, he also gave up his farm. He was a single parent with 4 small children whose mother had died. His correspondence with his children reveals how deeply he loved them. He was not some kind of escapist who wanted to be away from home to avoid family life and avoid his pain. He wanted to be with his children. He wanted to farm the land. He sacrificed all of that for the sake of his ministry. To bring, what was that ministry? To bring the sacraments to these Syrian immigrants who otherwise would starve spiritually. 3 years into his priesthood, in April 1907, Father Nicola set off on one of his long missionary trips, and he expected to be away from his children for many months. But in June, he was in Colorado, and he received word that his 11-year-old daughter, Anna, was very sick and near death. She was 11. He rushed home, but by the time he arrived in Kearney, she was unconscious. And she died on June 7th, and Father Nicola had to serve her funeral. He wasn't able to say goodbye, or hear her confession, or give her communion. It's hard to imagine how he must have felt. Surely, an event like this would have broken some men. His service to Christ meant that he wasn't there for his daughter as she lay dying. But Father Nicola did not curse God, nor did he abandon his post. It would have been completely understandable if Father Nicola had canceled his long missionary journey at this point. His daughter was dead. His sons needed him. His parish in Kearney needed him. Of course, they were mourning the loss of Anna too. She was one of their own. How could you blame him for staying home for a long while? But no, Father Nicola remained in Kearney for only 2 or 3 weeks, and then was back on the road, back to seeking out those scattered Antiochians and serving liturgies and baptisms and weddings and funerals. And again, he was not an escapist running away from his grief. He no doubt wanted to come home, but his duty to God came before all else. In all this, Father Nicola's model was St. Raphael. Over the coming years, Father Nicola continued his dual ministry as a priest of St. George Parish in Kearney and as a traveling missionary throughout the plains. St. Raphael's Syrian diocese was growing, and with more priests, there was a hope that Father Nicola might have fewer travel obligations. St. Raphael himself made a return visit to Kearney in September 1914, and he pushed for the parish to build a new church building. So things were looking up. But on the very day of St. Raphael's arrival in Kearney that September, storm clouds began to appear over the Syrian diocese. Metropolitan Dramanos Shahadi, an Antiochian bishop from Syria, arrived in America. Dramanos was here ostensibly for a fundraising trip to raise money for an agricultural school in his diocese back in Syria. But he also conveniently came to the safety of the United States just as World War I erupted in the Old World. St. Raphael was wary of Dramanos' true motives, but he gave him a blessing to visit the Syrian parishes and to raise money. And for a few months, everything seemed stable. Now, at this point, St. Raphael was only 54 years old. But all his missionary work had put a great strain on his body. And he started to show signs of weakness not long after he returned to New York from Kearney. At the end of 1914, he was bedridden. The end of his life came in February, and on February 27th, 1915, Father Nicola got a telegram in Kearney informing him that the great bishop had died. Father Nicola served as Resagian for St. Raphael's soul on Sunday, and then on Tuesday, he boarded a train for Brooklyn to attend the funeral. The Syrian diocese pretty much collapsed right then at the funeral, like literally at the funeral. So the Syrian priests started streaming into Brooklyn in the days following St. Raphael's death, and as they gathered together, they found themselves in disagreement. Some of them said that Raphael was under the Russian church. The Russian hierarchy had consecrated him. He was a bishop of the Russian church, so of course they needed the Russian church to give them a new bishop, a new Syrian bishop for their parishes. But others disagreed. They pointed out, well, St. Raphael, in his own words, said, and I quote, "Our diocese is a diocese of Antioch, notwithstanding its nominal allegiance to the Russian Holy Synod. So he's sort of presenting it in both ways, simultaneously. So which would it be? Russia or Antioch? So this was the beginning of what's known as the Rusi-Antiochi schism. Part of the problem in this case, part of the problem was the ambiguity of the way St. Raphael sort of acting as both an Antiochian bishop and a Russian bishop at the same time. Part of the problem, though, was that St. Raphael had no obvious successor. The main pro-Russian candidate was the highly ambitious, highly political archimandrite Efthymios Opaish. Efthymios' rival/ally was the very young, I'm talking like early to mid-20s, Archdeacon Emmanuel Abouhata, who had been St. Raphael's assistant in his final years. Neither of these guys was remotely qualified to be a bishop. On the other side, there was that troublesome but charismatic Antiochian metropolitan Germanos. Germanos had taken a shine to America, and America had taken a shine to Germanos. Many, many Syrians thought that, of course, Germanos should be Raphael's successor. I mean, he's right here. There were two problems. One, the Russians weren't on board with this, and two, neither was the Patriarchate of Antioch. The Patriarchate of Antioch didn't want Germanos to stay in America. They kept ordering him to come back to Syria because he had a diocese, and he kept refusing. It's interesting to me, nobody has ever, as far as I know, ever suggested this, but it seems to me that the best candidate actually to succeed St. Raphael was Father Nicola. He never would have been nominated. He was far too not political. He was too humble. He was too unambitious. He didn't have an impressive education. He wasn't part of the circle of influencers in the Syrian diocese. People like Opaish and Abouhata and Father Basil Kampawi of the Brooklyn Cathedral. But he was canonically eligible, he was morally upright, and he was self-sacrificing as a pastor. He would have been a worthy successor. Who knows what would have happened had the Syrians at the time been more open-minded and considered him. He would have been much more worthy than any of the men who were actually in the running, and much more in the mold of St. Raphael himself. But that is all speculative. No one considered Father Nicola as a candidate. Everyone was forced to pick a side. Who were you for? Efthymios or Germanos? Which was also framed as, should we be under Russia or should we be under Antioch? In hindsight, there was no right answer. St. Raphael, as we said, had been highly ambiguous when he talked about Russia and Antioch, and he also left behind no protege, no successor. To be blunt, both Efthymios and Germanos were unworthy. They were anoxios. World War I was raging. The Russian church waited 2 years before consecrating Efthymios, and by then Russia itself was in the throes of revolution. In the meantime, Germanos kept picking off parishes and refusing to go back home to Syria. And he started what he called the Antiochian Archdiocese, which is not the same as the current Antiochian Archdiocese. In the end, Father Nicola chose Germanos, which to him meant less about Germanos himself, personally, because Father Nicola didn't know Germanos that well. It meant more about choosing Antioch, firstly, and secondly, not choosing Efthymios. Because the one thing, in my opinion, that you couldn't do in that impossible situation is choose Efthymios. He was the wrong choice. Not that Germanos was the right one, but Efthymios was the wrong one. So I cannot fault Father Nicola for that choice. He was totally removed from church politics. He was trying to make the best decision in an impossible situation with two really poor options. And he suffered for that choice that he made. Emmanuel Abouhata, the Archdeacon Emmanuel, future bishop, on behalf of Efthymios and the Rusi faction, went around suing all the priests that sided with Germanos and trying to seize their parish property. He filed a lawsuit against Father Nicola, and he won. And in 1918, Emmanuel's lawyers were in the process of trying to seize Father Nicola's personal house. And at that moment, the Spanish flu pandemic hit. So the Spanish flu. In 1918, as troops returned home from the First World War, they brought with them a deadly strain of the flu. It's estimated that the Spanish flu killed up to 100 million people globally, and in America, about 28% of the population caught it, and over 500,000 people died. There was widespread panic. At various times, the governments, local, regional, state governments would order quarantines. The flu spread that year, 1918, in 3 waves. So the first and the least deadly of the waves came in the spring of 1918. The second wave came in late summer, and it peaked in October of 1918. And in that month, 1 month, it killed 195,000 Americans. So as all this was happening, Father Nicola was very busy. He was dealing with the Russi-Antaki lawsuit, thanks to Emmanuel. He had the prospect of losing his house because of that. His son and his daughter-in-law were expecting their first baby, his first grandchild. And in September, his new bishop, Metropolitan Germanos, visited Kearney. He came to town. So after Germanos left, Father Nicola went on his usual big-long missionary journeys. He probably first heard about this new wave of the flu, the second wave, during his travels in early October. He visited Wichita, and there was already a citywide quarantine in place in Wichita, so he couldn't serve the Divine Liturgy at the new Church of St. George, which was the first Orthodox church in Wichita. So while he was in Wichita, he went to people's houses, he anointed the sick, he served a funeral for a 16-year-old Syrian girl who had died while he was in town. There's a decent chance that Father Nicola caught the flu there in Wichita. Then he went back up to Nebraska. He visited scattered groups of Syrians, and then he returned to Kearney, just in time for the flu outbreak to hit the town. The local and state governments imposed a quarantine, and some of Father Nicola's parishioners were sick. And despite the quarantine, Father Nicola took the reserved sacrament and began going house to house, anointing them and giving them communion. A young man in the parish died, and then a toddler died. Father Nicola served funerals. More and more people came down with the flu. Father Nicola's own health continued to deteriorate. He was weak, his breathing worsened. He had to have known that he was dying. But he did not rest. I wonder if it even occurred to him to rest. Would it have been a temptation to a priest who had already sacrificed to crucify his own will and his own self-interest for the sake of Christ and his flock? A lesser man, a normal man, really, could have rationalized the need for rest. After all, he had great responsibilities. His parishioners needed it. They needed him to be healthy. All the other Syrians throughout mid-America needed him. His grandchild was due any day now, and his family needed him. But Father Nicola did not stop visiting his people, anointing them, giving them communion, helping them either to heal or to prepare to die. This, in fact, was his own preparation for death. He ministered to his people until he physically could not continue and literally just collapsed. This calls to mind the Lord himself, whom Father Nicola imitated and served. Having loved his own, he loved them to the end. His last words to his sons were, "Keep your hands and your heart clean." And he died in the middle of the night as October 28th turned to October 29th, 100 years ago tomorrow. The local Kearney newspaper reported, during the past week, Reverend Yanney worked faithfully among his parishioners here, many of them being stricken with the influenza. Considerable exposure, newspaper continues, considerable exposure to the disease was inevitable, and although he had complained of not being the best of health, he continued his work uninterrupted until the last. The Brooklyn Arabic newspaper Al Nasser wrote of Father Nicola's death, "It was the worst hour when we received the telegram from the children of Father Nicola. They told us that we had lost him because he was always the first to serve the people in the congregation." Father Nicola lived in the United States in the 20th century. He was not given the opportunity to die a martyr's death, but we cannot doubt that he would have embraced martyrdom. And the manner of his death echoes the martyric end of that great Antiochian saint, St. Joseph of Damascus. who was the dean of the patriarchal cathedral in Damascus, where St. Raphael's parents were parishioners. In 1860, when St. Raphael was in his mother's womb, Druze madmen rioted and massacred Orthodox Christians in Damascus. And amidst this chaos and bloodshed, St. Joseph took the reserved sacrament and literally jumped from rooftop to rooftop to go to his parishioners' homes in the middle of the night to give them communion and prepare them to die as martyrs. When he finally got cornered himself by the Druze, St. Joseph consumed the rest of the sacrament moments before he was brutally murdered. Father Nicola was not killed by an anti-Christian mob like St. Joseph was. But his faithfulness, his courage, his patient endurance of suffering, his selflessness, his devotion to his people to the very end demonstrate without question that he would have embraced martyrdom had he been presented with the opportunity. What then is the legacy of Father Nicola? He was a pioneering priest, a founder of parishes, a moderately notable historical figure for Antiochian Orthodoxy in America. But to me, his legacy is much more than that. He is an icon of what a priest should be, and a model for all of us, clergy and laity, married and celibate, all Orthodox of whatever jurisdiction. For all of us, he is a model of what true faith looks like in practice. And that legacy belongs not just to Antiochians of mid-America, but to all Orthodox Christians everywhere in the world. I suppose I should close by saying, may his memory be eternal, but there can be little doubt about that. Better perhaps to say, Holy Father Nicola, pray to God for us. Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions they would like to ask Matthew? Just stand where you're at and you can ask and answer. And if not, that's okay.
You don't have to ask questions.
I don't know what there really is to say after all. All right, we will continue the pilgrimage. Thanks again to everyone for coming. His grace, all at the head table, especially Matthew for those very inspiring words. We will continue our pilgrimage with a highlight as we come together for the Divine Liturgy. We'll begin Orthros tomorrow at 8:45. Hierarchical Liturgy will begin around 10. And hope to see you all there. We'll have lunch right back in this same room, and then we will depart home. So we'll ask dismissal and blessing from His grace.
For a second, just a second. When you come for Orthros tomorrow, and I hope you're there for Orthros, after the gospel reading, the priest brings the gospel book out to veneration by the faithful, correct? Tomorrow, the gospel book of Father Nicola will be brought out for you. The gospel book of Father Nicola is now resting on the holy table. It's no longer in that Keynote. It's resting on the holy table where it was when Father Nicola was the priest here, right in front of the tabernacle. The gospel book of Father Nicola will be used to begin the Divine Liturgy when the priest says, "Blessed is the kingdom." And the gospel book of Father Nicola will be carried by the deacon at the little entrance. So if you want to venerate the gospel, without a sheet of glass between you and the gospel, be there for Orthros tomorrow, and it will be brought out after the reading of the Orthros gospel. You know, Matthew mentioned that the Father's last missionary journey was to Wichita. He's counted as the founding priest of St. George Cathedral in Wichita. We have a list painted by our iconographer, the crocuses of all the priests. And the first one listed is Father Nicola Yanney. He encouraged the people there to buy a church building, the original St. George Church, but he never got to serve in it. He never came back for that additional visit to Wichita. But the people of Wichita did gather for the first Pascha in their own church building. Instead of being in a living room, they had a church building because Father Nicola had encouraged them to buy that. They spent $550 and bought a church building. And the first service, but without a priest, was for Pascha, where they could proclaim that Christ is risen. So let's end with a Paschal hymn. Because Christ is risen. The angel cried to the Lady full of grace, rejoice, rejoice of your virgin. Again I say rejoice, your Son is risen from his 3 days in the tomb. With himself he has raised all the dead. Rejoice, rejoice, O ye people. Shine, shine, shine home, New Jerusalem. The glory of the Lord has shone on you. Exalt, now exalt, and be glad, O Zion. Be radiant, O pure Theotokos, in the resurrection of your Son.
Glory to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, both now and ever, and unto ages of ages. Amen. Lord have mercy, Lord have mercy, Lord have mercy, Master of us.
God is with us through his divine grace and love toward mankind always, now and ever, and unto ages of ages.
Amen.
Christ is risen.
He is risen.